My name is Leah Price, and I've been a nurse for almost 10 years now. I don't scare easily. Hospitals can be creepy, sure, but when you've worked nights as long as I have, you learn to brush off weird noises and flickering lights as just old building quirks. That was until I worked at the Millard Fillmore Gates Circle Hospital in Buffalo, New York. This was back in late 2011. The hospital was in its final days, facing closure due to dwindling funds. It felt like a ghost town, even when the halls were filled with the hum of old machines and distant chatter. The waiting room on most nights was dead quiet. We'd get a few regulars, homeless folks looking for warmth, insomniacs who couldn't sleep, but one man stood out. He started showing up in November. A tall man, probably in his mid-50s, always dressed in the same grey overcoat, buttoned to the neck and a flat cap. He sat in the corner near the window, holding a newspaper. Not a phone, not a magazine, but an old, yellowed newspaper. At first I thought he was just another regular, but something about him felt off. He never spoke to anyone, never signed in for an appointment, and every time I walked by, he'd look down at the newspaper, though the pages never turned. I mentioned him to some of the other nurses, but they brushed it off. Hospitals attract strange people, Carla, the charge nurse, said, especially when they're about to close. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. His newspaper caught my attention. The print looked blurry, like it had been copied badly or had bled into the paper over time. The date at the top was unreadable, smudged like the ink hadn't dried properly. One night in mid-November, I decided to talk to him. The waiting room was empty, except for him. I walked up, forcing a friendly smile. "Sir, can I help you with something? Are you waiting for someone?" No response. He didn't even glance up. His eyes stayed locked on the paper. I leaned in, trying to read the headline, but the words blurred the harder I stared. My skin prickled. It felt like standing too close to a live wire. I stepped back quickly and left him alone. He came back the next night, and the next. By December, it was like he was a fixture of the place. The janitors complained about him once, said he wouldn't move his feet when they tried to vacuum. Carla told them to leave him alone. "What's the harm?" she said, but I couldn't let it go. Something about him felt wrong. When the hospital finally closed in March 2012, I took a position at St. Elizabeth's Medical Center in Utica, about 3 hours away. Millard Fillmore was dismantled quickly. Staff were reassigned, equipment sold, and the building boarded up. I was so busy with the move that I barely thought about the man in the grey coat. I figured he'd find some other place to haunt. But he didn't. A week into my new job, I saw him again. I was in the break room pouring coffee when I turned and froze. He was sitting at one of the small, round tables, his newspaper spread in front of him. Same coat, same cap, same smudged paper. I nearly dropped my cup. "Sir?" My voice cracked. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. I left the room so fast I forgot my coffee. My heart pounded as I leaned against the wall outside the door, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But I hadn't. There he was, the same man from Millard Fillmore. Over the next few weeks, he started showing up more often. Not just in the break room. I'd see him at the end of a hallway, sitting in an empty exam room or standing in the staff parking lot. Once I saw his reflection in a supply cabinet window standing just behind me. When I turned around, he was gone. I stopped sleeping. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I'd seen him at the foot of my bed. My friends told me I was working too hard, that I needed to relax, but how could I? He was everywhere. I was in the staff bathroom, brushing my teeth before my shift. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting weird shadows on the walls. As I rinsed my mouth, I saw him in the mirror. He stood in the doorway, staring at me. For the first time, he wasn't holding the newspaper. His hands hung loosely at his sides, and his eyes, they weren't right. They looked sunken, hollow, like they didn't belong to a living person. I spun around, nearly knocking over the sink. The doorway was empty. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the counter, gripping the edge until my knuckles turned white. I didn't move for a long time. That night, I broke down and told Susan, one of the older nurses. She'd been at St. Elizabeth's for over 20 years and had seen her fair share of strange things. I expected her to laugh it off or tell me I was imagining things. Instead, her face went pale. "You saw him too?" she whispered. She told me about the hospital's history. The building had been part of a state-funded mental health facility. Back in the 1970s, they'd conducted experiments on patients, electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation treatments that were experimental at best and inhumane at worst. One patient, a man in his 50s, had died during a procedure. His name was Edward Harlan. "People have been seeing him ever since," Susan said. Always the same description. A tall man in a grey coat, holding a newspaper. That night, as I drove home, I spotted something in the parking lot. A single piece of newspaper fluttering in the wind. I stopped and got out, my breath fogging in the cold night air. The paper was old, torn, the print barely legible, but the headline sent a chill down my spine. "Local man dies during experimental procedure." I took the paper home and shoved it in a drawer, hoping that ignoring it would make it go away. But the sightings didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. Edward wasn't just appearing at the hospital anymore. I'd see him on my drive to work, standing at a street corner, or in the reflection of a shop window. Always silent, always watching. In March, I started keeping a journal. It was the only way I could make sense of what was happening. I wrote down every sighting, every interaction, every sleepless night. I started noticing patterns. He wasn't just showing up randomly. It was almost like he was following me, trying to tell me something. One night, as I was finishing a late shift, I saw him again. He was standing at the end of a dark hallway, his figure barely visible in the dim light. For the first time, I didn't feel afraid. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to speak to him. "Edward," I said, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" He didn't respond. He just stared at me, his hollow eyes unblinking. Then slowly, he raised a hand and pointed to my bag. I reached inside and pulled out the newspaper I'd found in the parking lot. His eyes seemed to soften as he looked at it. And then, just like that, he was gone. That was the last time I saw him. It's been 3 years now, and not a day goes by that I don't think about him. I still have the newspaper tucked away in a drawer in my apartment. I don't know why Edward chose me, or what he wanted me to understand. Maybe he just wanted someone to notice him. Maybe he wanted to be remembered.